Here we are, we're human beings, in this extraordinarily wonderful world. We wake up and find ourselves in an environment which we seem determined to destroy. We find ourselves involved in a lifelong search for meaning. And we ask, is this world, beautiful, wonderful as it is, really all that there is? Or is there an invisible dimension which alone can lend purpose and meaning to life? It was on such a lifelong search for meaning that I came across the work of that remarkable individual who lived in the early years of this century, Rudolf Steiner. And we would like to speak about him and about some of the many contributions which have arisen from his spiritual scientific life work. Come, join us. Rudolf Steiner's fundamental gift to mankind was the formation of the science of the spirit known as anthroposophy, from the Greek words anthropos or man and sophia or wisdom. In northwestern Switzerland, near the city of Basel, spiritual scientific research is conducted in this building, which is called the Goetheanum. It was named for the German poet, scientist, and philosopher Goethe. It was designed by Dr. Steiner to be the world center for anthroposophical studies and the school of spiritual science. The school is structured much like a university, being composed of several departments called sections that have brought many innovative and practical advancements into a wide variety of fields. Students of all ages come here from around the world to deepen their education and understanding of humanity, of the earth, and of the cosmos. Now, just to give you the briefest possible sketch of Rudolf Steiner's early life. He was born on the 27th of February, 1861, in the old Austro-Hungarian Empire, in an out-of-the-way little town, now in Yugoslavia, called Kraljevec. His father was an employee of the old Austrian Railroad. He was a station manager and also a telegraph operator, and the family moved many times during Rudolf Steiner's boyhood. Very early on, this boy discovered that he lived equally in two worlds of reality. He lived in the outer world of reality, which we all share, but he also lived in an inner world of experience, which was as real or realer to him as the world that he could see and hear and touch. Very early on, as early as 7 years, he discovered that when he tried to share with others out of this world of inner experience, that he was met either with disbelief or with scorn and ridicule. And so at this very early age, he learned to keep silent about this world of inner experience. It was at this time, when he was only 8 years of age, that he discovered in his teacher's room a book that gave him the greatest possible joy. And this was a book of geometry. He describes in his autobiography how he spent weeks poring over this volume of geometry. And he said this gave him the confidence that there was in fact a realm of human experience which was accessible only to human thought, not to outer sense perception, but which was accepted as real. His father wanted him to be an engineer and therefore sent him into the neighboring town of Wiener Neustadt at the age of 11. And there he pursued a scientific career, studying mathematics, chemistry, physics, and biology. And it was there as a young adolescent at the age of 14 that he one day passed the window of a bookseller in Wiener Neustadt and saw lying there in the window a volume whose author was unknown to him and whose title conveyed no meaning to him whatsoever, but where he suddenly was overcome by the feeling, I must know what this book has to say. And so he spent the next week saving his hard-earned pennies, which he was earning at this time already to supplement the family income by tutoring boys of his own age or younger, helping them through their examination, and thereby gaining invaluable educational experience. He saved up his pennies and bought the book, and then discovered that the best way to use his time in his history lessons was to take the volume of Immanuel Kant to pieces and to interleave it into his history text, because his history teacher was simply recapitulating in his lectures what was already in the book, and that he could study at home. So although he looked like a serious history student at that moment to the teacher, he was actually absorbed, sometimes reading and rereading the same page 20 times over to understand and to be able to think in his own way the thoughts which he found expressed in this volume. The young Rudolf Steiner at this age hadn't the faintest idea that he was destined then, as a mature philosopher, to refute Kant, the great philosopher of the 19th century, who had proclaimed that there are absolute limits to human knowledge. Indeed, Steiner's view was quite the opposite, and led him to a new and deeper approach to education.
World of education, which comes out of Steiner's philosophy and his view of the human being, is of course very different from the materialistic one. So two views are extraordinarily prevalent all over the world today when you ask the question, what is a human being? And some people will say, well, a human being is nothing very much more than a highly developed animal. And another view, which is equally prevalent and equally, I think, destructive, is, well, the human being isn't much more than some sort of machine. And we feel, in world of education, that neither of these answers really meets the true dignity of the human being. So that every human being, whether adult or child, has something in him, has something in her, which is absolutely unique. And we'd like to call that, for the moment, the individuality. And this individuality is born, of course, into a body at birth, goes through a certain development, and gradually that entity, that individuality, becomes more and more himself or herself. And what we're concerned with in education is, how can we help that individuality to really become himself or herself? That the full potential which is in this being, in this soul, can really come to expression. And that means that the whole task of education is one of awakening. It's not a question of putting in. And it's interesting how Herodotus, the great Greek historian, put it already in a rather delightful way, I think. Education is not to fill a bucket. Education is to kindle a fire. So if we can fire, if we can spark the child's interest, the student's interest, then he or she will learn out of his own forces and want to explore and discover, because every child loves learning and discovering and exploring the world. So then the only question remains is, how do you do that? And you do that in such a way that the person, the child, the student, can awaken these faculties gradually, stage by stage.
We look at the child as an evolving human being who grows through many different stages of development. And so it's our task to find the approach to the child that fits that stage of development. So that if we look at the young child who lives in movement, who's very natural in the world of movement, then we have to approach the whole world through movement. And then when the children come into the elementary school, they live very much in their feeling life. And so the task of the teacher is to present the world, the subjects of the world, through feelings, through sadness and happiness and joy and sorrow, and to evoke in the children a connection with the subjects of the world. And then as they move into the upper elementary grades and into the high school, the children approach the world through their thinking. And so now, based on all that earlier richness that has been given to the children, now they begin to analyze, interpret, and to come to understand through their thinking.
And then, after puberty, it's a tremendous thing if the youngster can begin to feel, I can learn to find the truth. But truth is not a package. Truth is a process. And gradually, out of now these more individual forces that are at his or her disposal, to really begin to find, to seek, It's to discover the world and also to discover oneself.
It's always wonderful to talk to graduates of the Waldorf schools and to find out about their experiences after they leave the schools. Very often when they're at school, they're ready to get out, they're seniors, they're graduating, and they want to experience the whole world. But then when they have been in the university and they come back, they tell us that they have come to realize that they had a special education and that they think differently from many of their friends. And when we ask, well, how do you think differently? They say that, first of all, they always know a little bit about everything they're learning. They have a context in which to put it in. And even more than that, that they realize that learning is all integrated. And they have learned for the sake of learning. And their joy in learning and their understanding of the world as an entirety is something that they don't find their friends have. And they're very grateful for it. Often students will say, I knew I was going to go to medical school, and I told you I didn't have to learn history, and now I've decided I don't want to be a doctor, and I'm so grateful that I had history. Or why did I have to take history of music? And they get out into the big world and realize what a gift they've had. And so the fact that the curriculum is not an elective smorgasbord, but something that all students experience, becomes for them a great treasure.
We rejoin the young Rudolf Steiner as he too had just graduated from high school. And thanks to the fact that his father had managed to get a position within commuting distance of Vienna, it was possible for the young 18-year-old then to begin his career as a student in the then world-famous Vienna Polytechnicum, one of the great scientific schools of that time. And this takes us to 1879 and the move to Vienna. As you can imagine, Vienna in the 1880s was a great center of music and of art and of science and intellectual life, into which Rudolf Steiner plunged with the greatest enthusiasm. His friendships in these years meant a tremendous amount to him. It was also during these years that, thanks to one of his professors at the University of Vienna, who also taught at the Polytechnic, where Rudolf Steiner was an enrolled student, Karl Julius Schröer, that he met for the first time the work of the German thinker and writer Goethe. We think of Goethe primarily as a dramatist, a poet, but Goethe thought of himself and of his major contribution as that of a natural scientist. And it was at the age of 22 that the young Rudolf Steiner was asked if he would edit Goethe's natural scientific works for one of the national editions of Goethe's work that was then in process of publication. It was thanks to the recognition which he won for this work with Goethe that then at the end of the 80s he received the honor of being invited to the center of all Goethe research, to the Goethe-Schiller archives in Goethe's native city of Weimar, where he moved then in 1890. Here he was asked to edit all of Goethe's natural scientific works, of which he had edited a number in Vienna. It was also during these Weimar years that he took his doctorate of philosophy at the University of Rostock and published his dissertation under the title Truth and Science. The Goetheanistic approach to natural scientific investigation was to become part of the very foundation of anthroposophy.
When I was in Paris in 1981, I asked myself, what aspect of physics did I feel would be particularly open, if you will, to reading and exploration in this way, in the way in which Rudolf Steiner outlined on the basis of Goethe. Now, there are many aspects which could be approached that way. In principle, every aspect of natural science, I believe, is open to that. But for me, I chose the foundations of quantum mechanics. In particular, my area of research is quantum optics. That is to say, the modern study of light. What is light in its most fundamental nature? You can circle around the question from the standpoint of lasers and quantum optics. You can come at it from the simple standpoint of the sunset. You can think of it as an artist might. You can think of it as an Egyptian priest who saw light as the actual vision of Horus. Yeah? When the eye of Horus opens, there is light, and when it closes, there is darkness. So from the ancient all the way up to the most modern, one can circle round this being of light. The question then becomes, as a scientist today, working in a conventional scientific laboratory, are there yet new views, new ways of seeing this thing called light? Seeing it not only mathematically, which one of course does, but also trying to gain, as one moves into that domain, a kind of perception, artistic soul perception of the quality which is light. Not only the quantity which is light, but the quality which is light. The question which anthroposophy really raises is, into what do we place that knowledge? How do we extend and expand what it means to know, so that it includes dimensions to the nature of light, which normally are factored out and separated in our contemporary understanding. Traditionally, they were not separated out. Right? Robert Grosseteste, the founder, in some sense, of modern experimental science, was at the same time a bishop in England, a student of Dionysius the Areopagite, and his book on the celestial names. And at the same time as he's reading these theological tracts, he's also doing the first careful analysis of light from a scientific standpoint. And many historians of science have located the beginning of optics as we know it today with this individual. But he lived in two worlds, one profoundly spiritual and the other natural scientific. We have separated those worlds, and I think it is time for a rapprochement. A rapprochement which doesn't sacrifice the objectivity of science for some kind of vague mysticism of light, but actually brings the same clarity, the same scientific spirit, if you will, but brings it with modesty and with a kind of artistic touch into the world of natural phenomena, in the case of light, to the rainbow, to the sunset, and to laser light. In each case, one can discover a natural law, which, as Emerson said, is always the flip side of a spiritual law.
I had been an anthroposophist already when I studied, and I studied with an eye on becoming a teacher. But then my destiny brought it that I had the chance to apply everything I had learned to a deepening of mathematics. One might ask, what is that deepening of mathematics coming through anthroposophy? In old times, mathematical concepts were used to give images of higher concepts about the divine nature of the world, even as meditation objects. Plato is said to have said, "No non-mathematician may enter my school," because he believed strongly in the quality of pure thinking as a basis to grasp the true essence, the true beings, ideas as they are called in Platonic philosophy. Among all philosophies I know, it is only in anthroposophy that there is such a high esteem of the pure mathematical thought as one of the strongest means to educate the mind to be independent of sense perceptions. Anthroposophy, if I'm to say it in a few words only, tends to give people the possibility of higher knowledge of a world of spiritual beings. But in this world, man would be lost with our present-day custom of thinking in sense-perceptible concepts only. The physical reality is that reality we know. The ideal reality is unknown in our time. It's only mere hot air. Now, anthroposophy has the idea and gives teachings how to develop inner forces to conceive more of that world of, not of ideas only, of spiritual beings, and to have mastery of one's soul in that world. It is extremely helpful to have that mastery about thinking which pure mathematics and even applied mathematics can give you.
Rudolf Steiner moved from Weimar to Berlin just before the turn of the century. The Berlin years were radically different from those in Weimar. They were contemporary and avant-garde. Steiner became the editor of a literary magazine. He was a drama critic. He was producer and director of avant-garde theater. And in addition to that, for 5 years, he was one of the most popular of all the teachers in the great Karl Liebknecht Working Man's School. And it was during these years that an event of great importance in his biography occurred. We'll remember that in 1900, Rudolf Steiner was in his 40th year. And during all of these years since his childhood, he had been engaged in spiritual scientific experience and in genuine spiritual scientific research. And yet during all of this time, he had never been able to share with any audience the results of this second level of inner experience. And it was then in the year 1900 that Rudolf Steiner was invited to speak to a circle of people who are already interested in a spiritual science that had its origin in India and in the East, the circle of Theosophists around Count and Countess Brockdorf in Berlin. He was invited in September 1900 to speak about Nietzsche, who had died the previous month. This lecture was well received, and he was invited to return in a week's time to speak on a subject of his choice. He chose as that subject that remarkable fairy tale of Goethe, where, as he himself said, for the first time, he was really able to begin, even in a very modest way, to share some of his esoteric and inner experience. From this time on, he was a welcome guest in the circle of Theosophists, continuing his other work in the Working Man's School and in other associations. And this led then, in 1902, to Steiner's being asked to become the first leader of the then-to-be-formed German section of the Theosophical Society, of which Annie Besant was at that time the international president. He accepted with the understanding that he would never speak of anything which he was not able to speak of out of his own research and experience. He would not be merely a traditionalist. And with these years then, Rudolf Steiner steps forward as a teacher, an author, lecturer, and as a research scientist in the field of supersensible experience. From this time forward until his death in March 1925, Rudolf Steiner's life, public and private, was entirely devoted to his work as a spiritual scientist. It was during these years that he laid down his basic works: Theosophy, a study of the human being from the point of view of body, soul, and spirit; Knowledge of the higher worlds and its attainment, describing the path of individual self-development; and his fundamental cosmological work, Occult Science and Outline. During this time, Rudolf Steiner was also working with a number of physicians, including also the Dutch doctor, Dr. Ita Wegman, and developing his extended view of medicine, which also included a therapeutic work with the handicapped, which led to the establishment of schools and homes for the handicapped, the retarded, the maladjusted, which now exist on every continent of the globe.
The Sonnenhof was one of the first homes for handicapped people who was founded in Europe. It was started around 1924, and it was at the beginning part of the Wegmann Clinic in Arlesheim, and later on it was separated in a separate home. At the moment we have around 130 handicapped people here, from kindergarten age up to grown-ups. The children here, I said they are handicapped. That means some of them are crippled, but all of them are mentally handicapped. Some are just epileptics, and we have autistic children, we have the Down syndrome here, we have the whole variety, if you could say, of handicappedness here. and they live in dormitories with 5 to 8 children, and we try to mix them. So in a dormitory we have perhaps one wheelchair, and we have other children who can speak and talk, and they can help each other. So if we would have dormitories with only wheelchairs, that would be too difficult for the children and for the teachers as well. Often we see that parents feel punished with a handicapped child. They ask themselves, why do we have a handicapped child? We are so good people. And we who work every day with them, we think a handicapped child is not a punishment. In the contrary, it is a gift. But we have to learn to know, we have to find out what gift it is, because we can learn so much from the handicapped children. The so-called normal people nowadays have so much difficulty in being direct, being normal in a way, showing their joy and their warmth. The handicapped is in a way so simple and can't hide it, and just brings the warmth and the love. And for us to experience this is a great gift, and to work with them every day. This is one side of our work. The other side is that we know that we have more than one life, and our next life is based on this life, on what we do now here. Now the handicapped children will have difficulties in building up their next life. So we are helping them now and here to have a almost normal life, that they can build up their next life on a good base.
Anthroposophical medicine is an extended medicine because it does not oppose conventional medicine. We feel that conventional medicine has a lot of value and is also very appropriate for our times, but it is rather one-sided. So conventional medicine has a lot to offer in, let's say, in trauma, in surgery, and in new tools for diagnostics, but it does not really, let's say, deal with life as such, life as itself. And so the approach of conventional medicine, which is very much based in the natural sciences, is, yeah, in our opinion, one-sided. And what we want to add in anthroposophical medicine is a way of dealing with life, and also see that health and disease are the different sides of one coin, that health and disease are both actually natural processes. And by studying also a disease process to get an understanding of what a disease process is, and therefore also finding the right answer. So I do a lot of clinical research. That means that we test out investigational drugs in people who are infected with the AIDS virus, with HIV, who have an HIV infection. And I'm also in the midst of applying for a formal let's say, approval of the FDA to do a study, a clinical trial with Iscador, which is an anthroposophical medication which has been used over the last couple of decades, especially in Europe, in anti-cancer therapies. But together with Professor Quadja from the University of California in Los Angeles, we are researching the effect of the unfermented Iscador on HIV infection. And the preliminary results are very promising.
As a professor of pediatrics, I have to teach conventional medicine, but it is so important that this is taught in a way that the students learn the special responsibility we have towards our children, that we look at the child with devotion, that we really understand about the child development, how the individual here is going to incarnate into this body. And if we don't have this in mind, we will not teach pediatrics in a way that it can be practiced later on in life of those young doctors. I think it is very important that we have the right way of thinking around a child, even if we teach conventional medicine or conventional pediatrics. It makes a big difference the way the doctor handles a child. The child should never be an object of demonstration. So the way the doctor touches, the way the doctor handles an infant, for instance, or an older child, how he speaks to the mother and to the child is so important. And only by example this can be learned by the students.
This whole question of cause and effect, one can also look at at a different question in medicine and in medical science. And that's visible, for instance, as a question in what happens with the flow of the heart. How does the flow of the blood go? How is the heart involved in that? We take it that the heart is the one that actually pumps the blood through the arteries and the veins. However, it is known nowadays that the peripheral resistance, the resistance that is brought through the little vessels all over the body, that the peripheral resistance, it would be much too great for the heart to be able to pump against that. And another very interesting thing that is found is that in heart-lung machines, when people are doing open heart surgery, it has become clear that if you pump the blood through at the level that you would like, that doesn't work for the body. You have to adjust the heart-lung machine pumping to the flow of the blood that is offered by the body. And then as a third part of this question, one can look at embryology. In the chicken embryo it's very clear, but also in the human embryology it's clear that the flow of the blood is there before the heart is there. And so the question becomes then, if the heart is not pumping the blood, how does the blood flow? If it's not possible for the heart to do that, how does the blood flow? And it is these questions that in anthroposophical medicine one can try to think about. One can get tools to learn to think about these. But it's also very clear that we cannot stay with our normal way of thinking and only our sense impressions in that way. And the wonderful thing is that when you work with anthroposophical medicine in this way, that you learn to see also that the human being is part of the environment around him, that we have something to do with the animals, with the plants, with the minerals around us, and that what we have to do with them becomes then a possibility for a remedy. And so one can then also find in the illnesses that we find in human beings, one can find in the world around us medications or substances that can become medications. And there is now already for 60, 70 years, there are factories that make these medications, Vala and Veleda, in Europe, but they are really, Europe is where they started, but they are really worldwide organizations. They have daughter factories in countries all over the world, also in this country. And the remedies that are made there become then available. And the wonderful thing is that because in anthroposophical medicine the questions always come from the patients, from the need of the patients, via the physician. These factories do not make their remedies and then say to the doctor, well, here is a new medicine and you can use it for this or that. But through the meeting with the patient, the doctor comes to a question and then says to the Veleda or the Vala, could you help and make this medicine? Because I think that in this realm of the plant or of the mineral kingdom, we can find a remedy to heal this patient. And that is how we come to our medicines then.
And in addition to the work with the doctors and to many other initiatives that were going forward at this time, Rudolf Steiner was also working with farmers and gardeners toward the development of what we today now know as a worldwide biodynamic agricultural movement.
One of the most notable things about biodynamics, I think, for me, is the tremendous enthusiasm that it inspires among the people who use these methods and insights. And there are a number of reasons for it. People come to biodynamics out of their own search. Some people are interested to begin with in nutrition. This is an increasing thing because environmentally caused illnesses are growing quite a lot. So that's one reason people come to it. Another reason people come to biodynamics is because they are already established commercial growers, and either because of their own illnesses caused by agricultural chemicals or because they are tired of that way of looking at things, or, and this is more recent, because they are tired of spending the enormous amount of money on fertilizers and other chemicals. They decide that it's time to do something else. And I was told just the other day by a grower in Southern California that one of the main differences that he notices is that he says, you know, I used to spend all of my energy suppressing most of the life activity on my farm, and I wanted to just let a few different kinds of plants grow. I wanted to let there just be a few different kind of insects there, and I had to chemically suppress all the rest. So there was a tremendous battle going on, and I didn't realize until I stopped doing that and tried to take a more holistic approach and develop a balance within my farm between the various forms of life there, that I realized what a tremendous inner stress I had been under, always having to act out of a certain kind of sort of warfare of suppression. And now I feel like I'm working from within my farm in a very collaborative way there, as opposed to my trying to manipulate and suppress the processes.
In biodynamics, we try to look at plant growth in its entirety. We don't only consider where the plant is growing on the earth, in the soil, but rather we try to see the whole environment. And that includes the immediate environment, but also actually it includes the sun, the moon, and the planets. And that is something we have to consider. We have to see the plant needing earthly nutrition as well as what comes in from above. So the farmer, the biodynamic farmer, has to know about the cycles of the year, of the moon, where the moon is standing, about the planets. That's something to consider. Now, how can we grow healthy food? How should food be that it can nourish us in the best way? Food should never be forced to be grown quickly. That won't bring results that are healthy for us. That will just make the food sick, as it would make us sick if we only eat sugar or chocolate. We need to have things that can slowly nourish us and that we are not pushed in a certain direction. Now, usually when we look at fertilizing our crops, the farmer thinks of, well, how do I feed this plant? And so they say this and that is needed. In biodynamics, we have a different approach. We look at, well, what does the soil need? What do I have to give to the soil that it can provide all the plant needs? So it goes indirect, it goes through the soil. And when the soil is healthy, then the plant can grow. So I look at my soil and then I decide what I have to give. I also look, what will this plant need? Will it have to grow fast? Does it need fresher manure or older? And that is what I will provide. Now we mostly fertilize with compost. And all the manures what we use are well composted. And we guide this process with the use of certain fermented herbs, which are medicinal herbs like chamomile, stinging nettle, dandelion, and yarrow, and the like. And these plants, they have medicinal properties, and they help to break down the manure and make it more into a medicine, you could say, which in turn will help the plants to stay healthier. Then the needs for pest control are mainly eliminated. You see, we're trying to work with nature to grow the plants as healthy as we can, and then we don't have to fight nature with using all kinds of things to get rid of the pests.
The Demeter Association is the organization in the United States that is responsible for the certification of biodynamic farms and growers and processors. The reason it's called Demeter is because worldwide, Demeter is the trademark for biodynamically produced foods. The main difference between organic and biodynamic and what we look for in our certification process is a different view of nature and these specific interesting preparations that we are working with that spring from the anthroposophy of Rudolf Steiner.
As we mentioned earlier, Rudolf Steiner had been made the head of the German section of the Theosophical Society, but he came to realize that it became increasingly clear that the path of the Theosophical movement and that of Rudolf Steiner's work were diverging further and further from one another until the final separation came about in the year 1912 and 13, when Rudolf Steiner then emerged from the Theosophical Society and founded his own society under the name by which it is known today, of the wisdom of the human being, by the Greek word anthroposophy. It was also during this time that a young girl came to him, a dancer, who knew that the dance had had its origins originally in the temple as a sacred rite. And she asked Rudolf Steiner whether he could help her to guide the art of movement, the art of the dance, back toward its original sacred origins. He responded, and the response then we have come to know today as the new art of movement, the art of eurythmy.
Now one may ask the question, what is the difference between eurythmy and dance? The similarity is that we both use the human body as an instrument. The difference is that the movements are not contrived. They are totally out of the music. We have a piece of composition, a Beethoven for instance. We have to do what Beethoven wanted us to do, just as the pianist cannot play other notes when he plays a Beethoven sonata. So the eurythmist has to adhere completely to the laws of the composition, and then we have the Beethoven. It is really a stepping into the laws of the composition. That is what the eurythmy does. And in that, one may think, oh, one is very confined, but in actual fact, that is not so. The laws are incredibly vast and generous.
As I understand it, Rudolf Steiner saw eurythmy as standing between mime on the one hand and dance on the other hand. Dance, he felt, was more an expression of the human will as an emphasis, and mime more as an expression of human thought life as an art form. And eurythmy he saw as coming from the rhythmic system, from the human heart, in a more direct way. In dance, for example, the center of movement is generally below the solar plexus, in the weight center of the human being. And in mime you create images which are created physically, but you see the movements creating them, and it becomes a mental image. And so that's a more thought-related, more static form of movement. It comes to positions all the time. Also, dance tends to use the legs, the lower human being, much more in leaping and kicking, and to show a certain expression through that aspect of the human being. As one of my students once said, eurythmy comes from the heart. And that's really the joy that I find in eurythmy, that in spite of all the scientific laws that you have to study in order to be able to do it, there's tremendous freedom there to express the feeling that you have behind a piece of poetry or a piece of music. And that's, for me, the joy of eurythmy.
Darüber verlor ich Freud und Mut. Oh weh, die Münze rollte hier und dort und hastig sie an einem Ort.
Speech eurythmy is trying to make visible the movements that you make when you speak. And it's also trying to ensoul those movements so that it's not just an outer movement any more than it is when you speak to me. There's always the inner content as well as the outer movement. There are three different kinds of eurythmy. The most central one is eurythmy as an art form. Rudolf Steiner felt that that was the foundation of the other two. That was what came first. The second kind of eurythmy was pedagogical eurythmy. That's teaching eurythmy. It has a slightly different purpose than the performing eurythmy, different gesture. And the third kind of eurythmy is called curative eurythmy, and that's eurythmy that's done for people with various illnesses, and it's quite common in Europe. It's not so well known in the United States. Now the gestures are different. Performing eurythmy wants to speak directly from the eurythmist forward to the audience. In curative eurythmy, you want to do the movements in such a way that they react back on your own organism in a healing way. And pedagogical eurythmy is somehow between those two, because the main goal, of course, is not to produce performers necessarily, but to have a pedagogical effect on the developing children. That is to help them in their development and their growth as individuals, and so that they bring whatever gifts that they have to fruition, to flower somehow. So you're not necessarily disappointed if you have some students in the class who are having a difficult time in eurythmy. But likewise, the goal is not to make the teacher look good with a great performance, but yet the students should show their work to their parents and to their classmates and their teachers, because it is an art form, just as painting or drawing is an art form. But it's the process rather than the product that's the main goal in the teaching work.
It was also the artistic work, the work with the dramas, the work with the arts, that called for the need for a building which could house in an appropriate and beautiful way the work that was being developed within the movement itself. At first this was to have been designed and built in the city of Munich, but when that proved to be unpractical, land was offered to Rudolf Steiner in the northwest corner of Switzerland, in Dornach, where in September of 1913, less than a year before the outbreak of the First World War, the cornerstone for a most remarkable structure for which Rudolf Steiner was to be the architect-designer was laid. This building was indeed a most remarkable structure. It consisted of two domes of unequal size which intersected one another. The interior of both domes were carved in many different woods, and the interior of the domes themselves were painted in flowing colors, depicting the evolution of humanity and of the earth. This building was under construction for 10 years. During that time, men and women from 17 different nations worked side by side on its construction, along with the paid Swiss workmen. Many times the great guns sounded back and forth across the Rhine as they dueled between the French and the German lines. And many of the people who worked together as volunteers on this building, as sculptors, as painters, as helpers in one way or another, they had to say goodbye to each other in order to go off to fight in opposing armies. At the end of this time, after the building was already in use, on New Year's Eve 1922-23, the building was destroyed by fire, and in one night the work of 10 years of creative work and devoted effort and sacrifice went up in flames. Rudolf Steiner did not allow the destruction of this building to delay for as much as a single hour the program in which he was engaged, and he immediately turned his thoughts then to the design and construction of a second building, which this time was to be built entirely out of poured concrete. During the last months of Rudolf Steiner's life, when he was no longer able to leave his studio, he was still able to work on the sculptured model of the second Goetheanum building. This great building, which stands today with its soaring columns and beautiful sculptured forms, as an inspiration to countless visitors and architects from all over the world.
Steiner, as an architect, was a realist, a functionalist. At the age of 53, he began to be involved with architectural work and become a sculptor and a painter, and actively supervising and designing these great monuments and sculptures that these Goetheanum buildings represent. He gave new ideas to the art of architecture. He mentions that the world has been created, the divine creation, as it were, is ended, and it is now for man to continue this creation. And in order to be in harmony with this created universe, man in his creations has to follow the laws of original nature's creation. And without following these laws, we create disharmony in our environment. And of course, we are all experiencing this disharmony, this dissonance of man's creations with the creations of nature. But if you look at these Goetheanum buildings, how they sit in the landscape, in these gentle curved hills, the gentle curves of the building, the old and the new, you feel that this building, this sculpture, belongs and is grown with the landscape and not just added to it. A building that has in its grandeur a humility to surrender, to merge with the outer environment. Our buildings have arrogance in that we are making ourselves totally independent of our environments. Now, what are these laws that such a building should conform to? First, the law of polarity, where there have to be balanced and harmonized polarities like the inner and the outer, light and darkness, load and support, matter and spirit. Then the law of metamorphosis, where the change of physical form conforms to eternal law. Take a plant, the seed to the expanded plant, the flower, and the flower contracted into the seed. Then the functionality, which is a unique idea of Rudolf Steiner's, that the buildings must reflect in their outer appearance their function. By that, he does not mean a mechanical function like the motor or something, but rather that the shape, the form of the oak leaf represents the function of the oak tree. And so we see in the accessory buildings and the complex of the Goetheanum buildings changed representations of the basic building forms, in this case the old Goetheanum building, yet different in accordance with the functions that these buildings will have. In closing, I'd like to mention that the Goetheanum buildings, or buildings that conform to these higher laws of creations, will support man's and the community's moral developments. These buildings will be lawgivers. They will change by their appearance of beauty and harmony. They will change the social environment, will affect the beholder, and will make visible the good and the true.
The practice of the techniques revealed through anthroposophy can promote the evolution of human consciousness and bring the higher self to birth within the lower. The expanded awareness thus developed can give the individual insight into the spiritual causes which both precede and create the physical reality. In presenting these many practical aspects of Rudolf Steiner's life and work, it would be possible to overlook his central contribution to human thought at the present age. And that is that he recognized that we've reached a point in human history when the methods of natural scientific investigation can be extended to the exploration of the realms of spiritual realities. We hope that we have succeeded in this brief time in sharing some aspects of the life and work of this remarkable personality. Thank you for joining us at this hour.